The storm was a beast, howling against the windshield like it had teeth. Sheets of snow blurred the world beyond, erasing the road, the sky, everything. Grace clutched the wheel tighter, her knuckles bloodless. Each turn of the tires felt like a gamble on black ice. Her cruiser's headlights pierced no farther than a few yards ahead, swallowed whole by the blizzard. She hadn't wanted to come out tonight, but the call had been strange. Vague reports of a large dog seen wandering the icy highway. No collar, no owner, no prints leading in or out. And in this weather, that wasn't a stray, that was a tragedy waiting to happen. She pressed on, even as doubt gnawed at the back of her mind. The mountain swallowed sound. Grace's tires carved briefly into the snow, only for the white to fold back over the tracks like it never happened. The cruiser fishtailed slightly as she rounded a sharp bend, her breath catching in her throat. She eased the wheel, correcting with the reflexes of someone who'd driven through chaos before. Her radio hissed with static. Dispatch had cut out miles ago. No backup, no directions. Just a woman and a badge navigating blind through a storm. Somewhere out there, a dog was freezing, and she didn't know why that bothered her more than it should. The mountains had promised silence, and Grace had needed that. After the city, after that night, she hadn't just left the department. She left the noise, the guilt, the faces that looked at her like she should have done more. The girl had been 10, trapped in a burning apartment. Grace had almost reached her. Almost. But smoke had swallowed the hallway, and by the time she got through, it was too late. She couldn't unsee it. Couldn't forget the silence afterward. She'd hoped these small-town calls would be different. Simpler. Cleaner. But tonight already felt like the city's shadows had followed her here. Then, something. A flicker in the storm. Grace's eyes locked onto the dark shape too late. She gasped, slammed the brakes, tires screaming in protest. The cruiser skidded. Her heart did the same. When they finally stopped, her chest heaved in the hush. Right in the beam of the headlights, a figure stood unmoving. Large. Solid. A dog. No, a German shepherd. Tall and noble as a sentry. Its coat dusted in frost. It didn't run, it didn't flinch, it just stared at her. Eyes burning through the snow like embers waiting to be stoked. There was no fear. Only recognition? She opened the door slowly, the wind immediately slapping against her coat. Snow swirled in mad, hungry gusts, but Grace barely felt the cold. The dog hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. Something in her chest pulled. An invisible thread, a whisper of instinct she couldn't rationalize. This wasn't procedure. This wasn't a caution. This was something else. She stepped forward. The dog turned and walked deliberately off the road. Grace hesitated, then followed. She didn't know why, but somehow she knew that dog didn't just need help, it had a purpose, and she was part of it now. As she drew closer, Grace could finally see the shepherd more clearly. Its fur was matted with snow, ribs faintly visible beneath the thick coat. But its eyes were startlingly calm. Not scared, not feral, not lost. Waiting. She crouched instinctively, her voice low. "Hey there. Where's your person?" No bark, no growl. It only tilted its head, then took another step into the woods, pausing to look back. As if saying, "Follow me." Grace's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a stray. This dog had found her, and whatever it was leading her to, she wasn't ready for it. But she went anyway. Grace stumbled through knee-deep snow, her boots crunching softly beneath her. The wind howled around her like a warning, but she kept her eyes fixed on the German shepherd ahead. Unlike other strays she'd seen over the years, this one didn't bolt at the sight of a human. It moved purposefully, pausing every few yards to glance back at her, as if checking to see if she was still there, still following. There was something urgent in its gaze, something pleading. "Where are you taking me?" Grace whispered, not expecting an answer but strangely hoping for one. The dog didn't bark or whine. It just turned and continued forward, its golden-brown coat peppered with snowflakes, tail held high, not in fear but in determination. Each time she faltered, the shepherd waited. It wasn't fleeing, it wasn't lost. It was leading her, and Grace's gut told her, whatever it was guiding her to, it couldn't wait. They reached the edge of the woods, where the snow hung thick on every branch, untouched by footprints, even animal ones. Yet the shepherd moved with certainty, as if it remembered a path no one else could see. Grace scanned the ground. No tracks but theirs. No broken branches, no sounds of life. "How do you even know this way?" she muttered, brushing wet hair from her face. The forest seemed to hold its breath as they moved deeper. The snowfall grew lighter, but the silence felt heavier. Grace's pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. Something about this didn't make sense. Paths don't exist where no one has walked. And yet, here they were, following a trail written in instinct, not footprints. It emerged from the whiteness like a ghost. Small, camouflaged by time and snow, a crooked cabin almost swallowed by the landscape. You could have walked right past it and never known it was there. Grace froze. The German shepherd stood in front of it now, unmoving. It looked back once more, its eyes locking with hers, then sat down, tail curled around its paws. As the wind whipped harder, Grace could barely hear herself think. The cabin's windows were frosted, the wood warped by years of winter, but it stood stubbornly intact, like it had waited too. She stepped forward, her breath catching. Why bring her here? What did this dog know? Whatever was inside, she was meant to see it. She unclipped her radio and thumbed the button. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Grace Harper. I've located a structure in Sector 14, requesting—" Static hissed. She adjusted the dial and tried again. "Repeat, requesting immediate backup, possible." More static, then nothing. Grace lowered the radio with a tight jaw. The storm was too strong, too isolating. Out here, she was just a whisper in the wind. She looked back at the shepherd. It hadn't moved. It didn't seem surprised by the silence. "I guess it's just us now," she murmured. The dog blinked once, as if it understood perfectly. A low, heart-tugging whine broke the silence. The shepherd was at the cabin door now, pawing it gently, then with increasing urgency. Its ears twitched, and a soft growl vibrated from its throat, not in aggression, but distress. Grace's instincts flared. "Is someone in there?" she called, stepping closer. The dog looked at her, eyes wide with something dangerously close to desperation. Then it whined again, longer, louder, a plea. Grace reached for the handle. It was ice cold. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered. Another scratch, another whine. The silence inside was thicker than snow. Someone had been here, and they hadn't left long ago. She scanned the room. Blankets were rumpled. A cup lay sideways on the floor, steaming faintly. The fire in the hearth had burned out, but embers still pulsed like dying stars. Nothing was dusty, nothing decayed. Whoever lived here had only just left or vanished. Grace's fingers trembled as she touched the coat. It was warm. She looked to the doorway. The dog sat firm, still not crossing the threshold, still watching her like it was waiting for something more. She wasn't alone. Not really. Someone had just been here, and someone might still be. Pinned neatly to the log walls were pieces of paper, childlike, messy, full of stick figures and bright crayon colors. Grace stepped closer. A house, a family, a dark shape hovering nearby, almost like a shadow monster. And in each picture, front and center, a German shepherd. Her heart skipped. The same dog, over and over again. What kind of story were these pictures trying to tell, and why did they feel like warnings? Goosebumps rippled across Grace's arms, not from the cold, but something else, something primal. The cabin was too quiet, the drawings are too strange, and the dog, the way it paced outside now, back and forth, nose pressed to the crack in the door, it was as if it knew. This wasn't just a rescue, this was a message. Grace turned back toward the darkened hallway at the back of the cabin. Her flashlight beam flickered. Whatever she'd stumbled into, whoever this dog belonged to, it wasn't over. The real story hadn't even begun yet. Grace's fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped the last of the beef jerky she had brought with her. The storm outside howled against the cabin, the windows rattling in their frames. She could feel the chills seep through the walls, and her breath came out in a mist, the warmth of the fire flickering on the hearth doing little to banish the cold in her chest. The dog, dark fur, eyes gleaming with a strange wariness, watched her closely from the far corner of the room. There was something haunting about the way it stared, like it knew what was coming, but wasn't entirely sure it wanted it. It was as if the world had broken the dog before she could ever have the chance to fix it. Grace didn't move too quickly, afraid to startle it. She held out the jerky, its scent now filling the room, hoping for the smallest sign of trust. The dog's ears twitched. Its stance didn't change, but the slightest shift in its gaze let her know it was considering her offer. She took a step forward. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the dog stepped closer, sniffing the food in her hand. It didn't hesitate to take the jerky, crunching it between its sharp teeth, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. A small spark of connection flickered in the space between them. The dog, no longer just an unknown creature, had a name. Grace carefully lifted the dog's collar and saw the small silver tag hanging from it. The name Max was clearly etched, but the address was illegible, smeared with what looked like dirt or maybe the remnants of a forgotten time. Grace couldn't help but feel a pang of something sharp in her chest. What had happened to Max? Who had he been with before? As the storm outside worsened, she sat on the old wooden floor beside the dog. She watched him carefully, his coat matted with snow, but his eyes now holding a soft vulnerability that made her heart ache. Max looked up at her, his eyes calm yet alert. In that moment, Grace realized he wasn't just a stray, he was a survivor, just like her. The night was long, and the storm didn't show signs of letting up. The wind howled as if it were trying to tear the cabin apart. The walls groaned under the pressure, but inside, a strange stillness had settled. Grace sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, her thoughts drifting to the past. But just as the silence became unbearable, she felt it. A soft pressure against her boots. Max had silently come over, laying his head gently at her feet. Her heart skipped. He wasn't just lying there. He was trusting her, offering her something she wasn't sure she deserved. His quiet companionship felt like an unspoken promise, one that, for now, neither of them could break. They were alone together in the snowstorm, two lost souls seeking warmth in a world that had forgotten them both. The night passed, but sleep was elusive for Grace. She drifted in and out of troubled dreams, memories of a past she'd tried so desperately to bury. In her dream, she was running through a dark alley, searching for someone. Her heart raced as she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. The girl, she could never quite see her face, was gone. But Grace knew, deep down, that she hadn't done enough. She hadn't been there when it mattered most. Grace woke with a start, her breath shallow, her body covered in a cold sweat. Max was there, lying next to her on the floor, his eyes soft with concern. He seemed to sense her pain, his nose nudging her hand gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered, feeling the weight of her guilt pressing on her chest. Max's silent presence was the only comfort she could find. When morning finally came, the storm had not relented, but the light of day brought with it a strange peace. Grace sat on the steps of the cabin, her eyes drawn to the pure, white snow outside. It was a quiet world, with the storm still howling in the distance. But here, in this small corner of the world, there was stillness. Max padded over to her, his paws crunching the snow, and nudged her gently with his nose. She blinked at him, her thoughts still heavy with the dreams that had haunted her. Max didn't bark or whine, didn't demand anything from her. He simply turned and walked to the edge of the yard, looking back over his shoulder as if to say, "Follow me." Without thinking, Grace stood up and followed. Something told her that Max knew something she didn't. He led her through the snow-covered woods, each step careful and deliberate. She had no idea what he was looking for, but she trusted him. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't question her instincts. Max led Grace to the back of the cabin, where the snow had settled deeper, forming drifts along the floor. At first, Grace thought he was just leading her outside to explore. But then Max stopped, standing over an old rug that lay half-draped across the floor. He pawed at the rug, his claws scraping against the wood. Grace watched in confusion before kneeling beside him. With a low growl, Max nudged the rug further aside, revealing something beneath, something that shouldn't have been there. A trapdoor. The wood was ancient, the edges worn down by time. But as Grace ran her fingers over it, she could feel the rusted lock just barely visible beneath a layer of dust. It didn't belong. It didn't belong in a place like this. Her heart began to race. What was hidden below? Grace stood there for a long moment, staring at the trapdoor, uncertainty flooding her mind. She could feel the tension building in Max's stance. His body was rigid, his eyes narrowed, and his ears were flattened against his head. He growled softly, the sound low and steady, not in fear, but in warning. Grace hesitated, her hand resting on the trapdoor, feeling the weight of the decision in that moment. Should she open it? Should she leave it be? But Max wasn't backing down, and something in her, something she couldn't ignore, told her that she needed to press on. That whatever was below, whatever secret lay buried in the darkness, was something she needed to confront. Back inside the cabin, Grace sat at the old table, staring at the faded drawings pinned to the wall. They had been drawn by the children who once lived here, their faces filled with wide-eyed wonder. But now, as Grace's gaze moved across the room, she saw something different in the drawings. One, in particular, stood out. A new image had appeared, drawn in a child's crude lines. A girl, her face hidden in shadow, locked behind a door. And standing beside her with fur bristling was Max, the same dog who was sitting right next to her now. Grace stared at the drawing, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Max was somehow tied to this, tied to the girl who had vanished, and to the secrets buried in this cabin. She felt it then, deep in her chest, a heavy weight that she hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about saving herself, a second chance, a chance to make things right. Max sat silently beside her, his eyes never leaving the trapdoor. He knew, and so did she. Max's stance grew even more resolute as he sat near the basement door, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. He refused to leave it, as though he was guarding something that needed to be uncovered. Grace took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the door handle. Whatever was waiting for her beyond the trapdoor, whatever secrets were locked away, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't facing it alone. And with Max at her side, she wasn't going to turn back. Grace's fingers were raw, the edges of her nails breaking as she pulled with all her might on the rusted trapdoor. The air around her smelled stale and heavy, thick with the stench of mildew. Her heart was hammering in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Below, in the dark, she could hear the faintest sound, a scrape against wood, a soft whimper that seemed to cut through the silence like a scream in the night. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking, and forced herself downward. There was no turning back now. Max, ever loyal, stood behind her, his low growl a constant reminder that he would never leave her side. The basement felt like a tomb, its air so thick with dust that it clung to Grace's skin and lungs with every breath. She tried not to let the oppressive quiet overwhelm her, her ears straining for any sound that might reveal the truth of what lay hidden in the shadows. Then, just as she thought the darkness might swallow her whole, a soft, trembling whimper pierced the stillness. Grace's heart jumped in her chest. It was faint, fragile, almost as if the very sound itself was barely clinging to life. She moved toward it, every step feeling like an eternity. The sound led her deeper into the basement, toward an old stack of crates pushed carelessly against the far wall. Max stayed close by her side, his large form a steady presence in the gloom, his eyes scanning the darkness with the intensity of a predator. Grace's flashlight flickers slightly before catching on the figures crouched behind the crates, two small bodies huddled together in the corner. At first glance, they appeared lifeless, their pale faces turned toward her in unnerving stillness. But as she approached, her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she could see the slight rise and fall of their chests, barely noticeable but there. She knelt beside them, her hands gently shaking them awake, whispering softly to reassure them. Their skin was cold to the touch, their bodies stiff with fear and exhaustion. One of the children, a little girl no older than 5, opened her eyes just enough to meet Grace's gaze, wide, haunted, but alive. Max moved closer, his tail low, his eyes softening as he instinctively sensed the danger the children had faced. He licked the girl's face gently, his warmth offering comfort where human words couldn't reach. Slowly, the girl stirred, her lips parting in a weak smile. Max's soft growl seemed to calm the children, his large frame a pillar of reassurance in the otherwise desolate basement. The boy, perhaps a year older than his sister, stirred next. His breathing was shallow, but as Max's warm tongue brushed his cheek, the boy's eyes fluttered open. Grace's voice was soft but insistent, urging them both to stay awake, to hold on. She felt their pulse, their vital signs weak, but steady enough to keep hope alive. As Max continued to nudge them gently, Grace's mind raced. They had been through hell. She didn't know how long they'd been trapped in this cold, damp basement, but she knew one thing: they needed to get out, and fast. The quiet, fragile peace that had settled in the basement shattered in an instant. A loud, violent slam echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots, heavy and purposeful, striking the floor. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound. She knew who it was. The predator had returned. Max's body tensed beside her, his eyes narrowing with a ferocity that made Grace's blood run cold. She didn't need to give him orders. He was already one step ahead, his instincts honed to protect, to defend. The boots grew louder, closer, each thud of them hitting the floor like a countdown to disaster. Grace's eyes flicked toward the children, fear flooding her chest as she realized they weren't ready for what was coming. She had to think, had to move. They couldn't stay down here, not with him approaching. "Hide," Grace whispered urgently, her eyes darting around the room. Without a word, she grabbed the children by the shoulders and gently pushed them behind an overturned table, hoping the shadows would shield them from sight. Max followed them, his body acting as a living barricade between the children and the incoming threat. She had no time for fear, no time for hesitation. Grace stood up, her body tense and ready. She drew her gun, the cold steel a bitter reminder that she was about to face the nightmare she had been running from. She stepped into the open, her chest tight with the weight of the moment. Her hand was steady, but her mind raced as she calculated her next move. She was trained for this, trained to fight, to survive. But this was different. This was personal. The footsteps grew closer, each one echoing in the stillness, each one like a death sentence. Before Grace could make her move, the man appeared, tall, dark, and menacing. He lunged at her with wild fury, his face twisted in a mask of rage. But Max was faster. With a low growl, he sprang from the shadows, his body colliding with the man's chest in a blur of fur and muscle. The man hit the ground hard, grunting in pain as Max pinned him there, his jaws snapping just inches from the man's throat. Max wasn't just protecting Grace anymore. He was protecting the children, the innocent lives that had been caught in this nightmare. Grace wasted no time. She had trained for moments like this. She moved in, her gun still raised, and slapped the cuffs onto the man's wrists. The man struggled, but it was futile. Max stood over him, his growl deep and guttural, a reminder that anyone who threatened this family would face his fury. With the man subdued, Grace turned her attention to the children. They were safe, for now. Max's eyes never left the siblings, his body a silent guardian as Grace quickly radioed for backup. But the man wasn't finished. His voice, still thick with anger, cut through the air. "They aren't the only ones," he yelled, his words sending a chill down Grace's spine. Her blood ran cold as she realized the full extent of the horror. This wasn't just about 2 kids. There were more, so many more. Grace opened the back of the van, her hands trembling as she reached for the folder the man had been hiding. Inside, there were faces, dozens of them. Children, families, all marked with a fate just as dark as the one these 2 had barely escaped. The weight of the mission settled heavily on her shoulders. This was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But she would never stop fighting. For the children, for Max, for the ones still out there. Grace tossed and turned, her mind a storm of memories she couldn't escape. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of Max's breathing, steady and soothing as he curled up at the foot of the bed. His fur, still slightly damp from the days they spent together in the wilderness, felt like a warm, comforting weight on her heart. Each moment they'd endured together played on a loop in her mind. The cold, the hunger, the panic. But most of all, the pure, unwavering trust that Max had shown her. When she had fallen, broken and desperate, it had been Max who had stayed by her side, never leaving her alone in the dark. He had been her protector, her companion, her hero. And now, lying beside her, Max wasn't just a dog. He was her lifeline. Grace's eyes filled with tears as she gently reached down, her fingers brushing the soft fur of his back. "You saved me," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. It wasn't just the children he had rescued. It was her, too. The morning news was filled with praise for Grace. The headlines screamed of her bravery. Local woman rescues 2 missing children after days in the wilderness. Grace couldn't bring herself to look at it for long. She didn't feel like a hero. She hadn't been the one who had done the impossible. Max had. The reporter's words blurred into the background as Grace sat in her living room, her fingers tightly gripping the mug of coffee that had gone cold. She glanced over at Max, who was curled up on the couch, his eyes half closed, as if he too was still processing everything they had survived. The interviews had been endless, the accolades pouring in, but none of it felt real. None of it had ever been about attention. She looked at Max again. He was the one who had found them, the one who had kept them safe in the wild. It was his unwavering loyalty that had made their survival possible. The shelter was filled with visitors eager to meet Max. News of the dog who had played such a pivotal role in saving the children had spread quickly. People came, wanting to adopt him, to take him home. Grace could see the pitying looks in their eyes when they spoke of how he had been rescued, but none of them were his real family. She overheard a conversation between the shelter workers and a man who claimed to be Max's owner, but there was no record, no proof. No one had come for him, and no one seemed to care. They were all eager to give him a new life. But Max wasn't just a hero. He was part of Grace's life now, and he had no place with strangers. Standing at the adoption desk, Grace's heart pounded in her chest. The papers were in front of her, but she hesitated. She had been here before, making decisions, signing papers, always second-guessing herself. But this time, the choice was clear. Max sat beside her, his gaze steady and trusting, as if he knew what she was about to do. His tail wagged softly, a gentle reminder of the bond they had forged over these long, difficult days. Taking a deep breath, Grace signed the papers. Her hands shook, but the decision felt right. "He's mine," she whispered, and with that, Max was finally home. Grace had never considered herself a person in need of saving. She had built walls around herself, keeping people and animals at arm's length. But Max had slipped through those walls in a way no one else ever had. She looked at him now, his warm brown eyes gazing up at her with quiet understanding. There were no words, but there didn't need to be. Max had been her savior in more ways than one. Slowly, she began to open up, letting her emotions spill out in fits and starts. She talked to him, told him things she hadn't been able to say to anyone else. Max didn't judge. He just listened, his presence a constant, calming force. It was as if he had always been there, waiting for her to let him in. And now, Grace realized, she needed him as much as he needed her. Therapy had been a long road, and Grace had never fully faced the pain of losing the girl she once cared for. But with Max by her side, the process had become bearable. He was always there, his head resting gently on her lap, offering silent support when the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, Grace shared the truth about the girl, the guilt, the sorrow, the regrets that had haunted her. As she spoke, Max's eyes never left her face. She expected tears, but none came. Instead, she felt a sense of peace, as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally lifting. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was the one to blame. Max had brought healing, not just for the children they had saved together, but for the broken parts of her that had been waiting for someone to fix them. A few months later, Grace found herself standing in front of the family of the missing children, Max by her side. The siblings, now safe and thriving, had grown fond of Max. They ran to him, laughing as he licked their faces, their joyous giggles filling the room. For the first time, Grace saw the healing that had come from the bond between them all. She had saved them, but in a way they had saved her too. They had reminded her of the good in the world, of the hope that still existed, even after everything she had been through. Max chased the children through the yard, his tail wagging as they laughed and tumbled over the grass. Grace watched from the porch, a contented smile on her face. It had taken time, but now it felt like life had finally returned to normal. The sunlight bathed the yard in warmth, the sound of the kids' laughter filling the air. It was a sound Grace never thought she would hear again, but now it was a constant presence in her life. Max had brought the light back into her world, just as he had brought the children's laughter back to theirs. Grace stood beside Max, gently clipping a shiny new tag to his collar. It wasn't just any tag, it was engraved with a name, a title, a reminder of everything they had been through. Max, hero. Max didn't understand the significance, but Grace did. This was more than just an animal. He was a hero in every sense of the word. As Grace knelt beside Max, she whispered the words she had been holding back for so long. "You didn't just find them. You brought me back, too." Max looked up at her, his eyes filled with love and loyalty. At that moment, she knew that their bond was unbreakable. He had saved them all, and in doing so had given Grace a life worth living again. She had found a partner she never knew she needed. Grace watched Max, her loyal companion, frolicking in the wind, his fur tousled, his joy infectious. The sight of him, carefree and unburdened, was a stark contrast to the woman she had been just a few months ago. Broken, haunted, and afraid to let anyone close. Max's transformation was her own. As he ran, Grace felt a stirring deep inside her, a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She realized that in saving others, Max had unknowingly helped her heal. The pieces of herself that she thought were lost forever were slowly returning, one paw print at a time. The truth hit her like a wave. Max had come into her life like an unexpected storm, shaking her world and bringing chaos. But through it all, he had been there for her in ways she couldn't have imagined. He had given her more than just companionship. He had given her a reason to believe in hope again. While she had set out to help him find safety, he had helped her find herself. Max had rescued her heart, piece by piece, without ever asking for anything in return. Their bond grew in the simplest of ways, sharing quiet moments on the porch, Max's steady presence by her side when the world seemed too loud. He had been the stillness in the storm of her life, grounding her when everything else was falling apart. The dark shadows of her past, of grief and loss, slowly began to fade, replaced by a courage she didn't know she had. Through Max's eyes, Grace saw the world differently. No longer was she just a woman who had lost everything. She was someone capable of rebuilding, someone worthy of love and trust once again. At that moment, Grace understood that Max had entered her life for a reason. He wasn't just a stray who had found his way to her doorstep. He was a guardian, a guide who had come to show her that it was possible to heal. Their meeting hadn't been by chance, but by design. Maybe the universe had known that Grace needed someone like Max to help her find the strength to move forward. What had started as a rescue mission had turned into something far deeper, an unspoken bond between two souls, both lost and both needing the other. Max wasn't just a pet. He wasn't a typical dog. He had no cape, no title, no recognition from the world. But in Grace's eyes, he was the truest kind of hero. A hero who had saved lives, not through grand gestures, but through quiet, unwavering love and loyalty. He had no need for praise or awards, yet his every action spoke volumes. Max was the kind of hero that the world rarely sees, the one who carries hope in his eyes, who asks for nothing, and who, in his own way, changes everything. As Grace knelt beside him that day, watching him chase the wind like a carefree puppy, she whispered. You're my hero, Max. You always will be.